It's been over a year now, and the Ukrainian conflict is still not resolved despite the continued support of Western allies and the USA to Ukraine. Naturally, they don't want to be directly involved in it, and it's no secret that a looming nuclear threat ties their hands. At the same time, the United States have the ability to secretly fight in Ukraine, but we do not observe this, and there are no rumors of the hidden participation of the American military. In this video, we'll discuss why the US is not doing that, and what are they afraid of. Let's start by saying that both the US and Russia have a history of resorting to covert operations and using the tactic of hybrid conflicts. The most recent ones for Russia were between 2014 and 2022, before they launched a full-scale offensive against Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea started with covert tactics too. In February 2014, unmarked soldiers began popping up all over the peninsula. At that time, Russia denied its involvement, and its officials claimed they have no idea what kind of military it was. These forces seized or blocked key Crimean structures, and later a referendum was held, resulting in Crimea joining Russia. A lot of countries don't recognize the validity of this referendum to this day. Even after that, the Kremlin kept denying the involvement of its military. After a whole year passed, Putin himself finally revealed that this was part of a special operation he was personally overseeing. The conflict in Donbass began in a similar manner, this time with a former FSB operative Igor Strelkov and his detachment infiltrating Donbass's territory, thus provoking a response. The Russian army has repeatedly taken part in clandestine operations in Donbass, but Kremlin officials have always denied it. Numerous Russian soldiers were taken prisoner on its territory, and the subject was thoroughly investigated by publications like Insider and Bellingcat. Due to this state of affairs, a neologism, "they are not there," was coined, when Russia covertly conducted an operation on Ukrainian territory while officially denying the whole thing. And this begs the question, why can't the United States and Western allies do the same? Send their troops to Ukraine and just vehemently deny their involvement, putting the phrase "they are not there" in every single report. We'll get to that, but first. The United States have also conducted multiple secret operations in third world countries, and for a long time concealed and denied its participation there. This was not uncommon during the Cold War, when hybrid conflicts flooded the world and the United States and the Soviet Union were involved in them one way or another. For example, the United States conducted clandestine operations in Laos and Cambodia, while denying having been there at all. These operations were conducted in the context of the war in Vietnam. Firstly, the United States feared the establishment of communist regimes there, so it supported anti-communist forces and even intervened directly. There were indeed great risks of communist regimes emerging there, which would have weakened the Americans' positions in Vietnam. And secondly, the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a route used by American guerrillas, went through these countries. It was used for the supply and passage of almost all North Vietnamese troops. For example, during the so-called Operation Menu, the United States bombarded Cambodian territory for a year on a regular basis, while the American Congress did not even know about it. These sorties were conducted under the guise of shelling Vietnamese territory. Laos suffered a similar fate, with clandestine bombings that inflicted significant damage to the local population. Later it was discovered that 3 million tons worth of bombs were dropped during the war. In addition to bombing raids, there were also forays by US Special Forces to conduct operations. When this information was made public, it caused serious discontent in American society and greatly added to the anti-war sentiment in the United States at the time. There have been other instances of the United States secretly fighting or even overthrowing a country's government. For example, in 1953, the United States and British intelligence agencies staged a coup in Iran. The Pinochet-led coup also took place with the help of US intelligence services. Bottom line is, the United States has had experience in hybrid conflicts and conducted covert operations in the past. But how come they do not employ such tactics in Ukraine today? The first reason is fear of nuclear escalation with Russia in the event of a direct clash of forces. As we mentioned earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union waged hybrid wars throughout the Cold War. But in fact, there were no direct skirmishes between the sides, although there were some critical moments in Korea and Vietnam where they could have potentially occurred. Nevertheless, even back then it was clear that a direct confrontation would result in escalation and a real nuclear war. That's why both countries avoided each other. Usually, they simply supported the opposing sides financially, with weapons or personnel, often sending their instructors who did not take part in combat. That's exactly what happened in Afghanistan and Vietnam. The United States provided the Mujahideen with military equipment, but did not directly intervene in the conflict itself. Same goes for Russia. Their intervention also took place with caution and avoidance of NATO and the US. The hybrid conflict in Ukraine did not entail such risks, unlike the one in Syria, but those isolated cases did not lead to escalation. The motives are always the same: preventing the world from spiraling into nuclear war. Both sides understand this and don't actually want to press the red button, even though they keep threatening each other. Any uncovered involvement of the United States Army in Ukraine would lead to a direct confrontation with Russian troops, with the situation getting out of hand pretty quickly. Regular skirmishes between Americans and Russians would have been impossible to hide, making this a global conflict and escalating the nuclear threat. That's why the United States does not take any risks with such tactics, and the NATO bloc even openly states that it avoids direct confrontation with Russia. The second reason is the discontent of the American public. Democratic governments exercise their authority only through popular approval, and when that approval falls, they cease to be legitimate. After a year, the American public started debating whether they should support Ukraine at all. Some want to shift the country's political vector towards isolation and focus on a more serious enemy. That would be China. Republican leaders quite often use this kind of rhetoric and gain significant public support. This discussion was triggered by major expenditures that some feel were unnecessary. Obviously, the public's reaction would have been more critical if US forces had been directly involved in the conflict and had suffered casualties there. We can prove that by looking at US history. Going back to the Vietnam example, casualties among their troops is what caused the Americans to rethink their role in a war on another continent. Later, the United States population became much more sensitive about their losses overseas. For example, after the Beirut barracks bombing that killed 241 American soldiers, the United States decided to withdraw its troops from Lebanon, since the operation lost its approval among the people. Engaging in a full-scale war in Ukraine would result in far greater casualties, which would cause resentment among ordinary Americans. Moreover, the United States has no obligations to Ukraine, unlike NATO countries and other allies. That's why even weapon shipments rose so many eyebrows. Instead of direct confrontation, the United States preferred to put pressure with sanctions, hoping to destabilize Russia's economy, but that might take years to achieve. Of course, it's worth mentioning that many Western volunteers, including those from the United States, are fighting for Ukraine. They have no affiliation with the American government, though, so this cannot be considered as a direct involvement. Similarly, Russia's paramilitary organization PMC Wagner often conducts operations in third world countries, and it's not formally considered as Russia being involved. Many volunteer to fight for Ukraine, like the Mossad Group, which was created on the basis of former Western military personnel who had participated in other wars. It was founded by Andrew Melbourne, a retired US Marine colonel. However, given the scale of the conflict, such groups' participation is limited, and they are unable to tip the scales. In conclusion, the United States has enough experience in covert ops overseas, but in this conflict specifically, they are afraid to escalate and pursue goals that might upset the general public. Therefore, they refrain from direct intervention and only provide financial and military assistance.